Mr. Donfried, I do thank you very much for your kind words. It's always been a pleasure to work with you. We have mentioned some of our joint endeavors in the past. And of course, a warm welcome to all of you who managed to come here today. Although there are many, many events going on. I just came from one. I'm continuing to attend the other one, so I do appreciate you being here. As you have heard, I will be talking about transatlantic relationship. I will be talking about security. You have noticed that, in fact, I was Slovenian Perm Rep to NATO for almost 5 years, so I've been somehow involved in these issues in the past. When choosing the title of my today address, I was thinking about how to best be a realist and an optimist when talking about the transatlantic security. Namely, as you have heard, the title of my address is Challenges and Opportunities in New Reality. I put a new reality in the title. Why? Because I believe we are in it. In the decades of the Cold War, the danger for the United States and substantial part of Europe was clear and present. That, among other historic facts and links between the two continents, meant a natural space for the common security. Together, we shared common values of liberal democracy, human rights, and free market economy. By the end of the Cold War in the 90s, which witnessed an unrivaled Western preeminence, brought, on the other hand, many uncertainties and novelties in the established world order. My country, Slovenia, can share its own experience of transition of the European East. I dare to say, a successful transition into fully fledged democracy. After gaining the independence, Slovenia had a clear vision of where it belonged and what it wanted as its strategic future, and that was transatlantic integration. The changes in Eastern Europe and the disintegration of the Soviet Union clearly changed the notions of immediate threats. Consequently, the transatlantic partners expanded their action and influence on a global scale. And NATO, as I said, I was representing my country in the North Atlantic Council for 5 years. NATO, in the meantime, shifted its identity from a territorial defense alliance into an organization closer to crisis management. Of course, the threats did not disappear, but they became different, and some of them caused real challenges to the transatlantic partnership itself. Even today, there are some issues that make that natural relationship uneasy from time to time. Changes in the world and in the recent years have been many and profound. Some experts characterize it as a multipolar in contrast to the bipolar system of the Cold War. But I think the word interpolarity in some cases would be more suitable. The global shift is happening and the world is more integrated, more complex, less black and white with many shades of gray. So what kind of institutions, what kind of system do we need? Are there better prospects for the multilateralism, unilateralism, or maybe a regional cooperation and integration? One thing is certain. These changes are affecting the transatlantic relations in many ways, putting the leadership on the both sides of the Atlantic to a serious test. And they are not affected only by global changes, but also, or even more, by the changes happening in the partners respectively. Both US and Europe are facing serious consequences of economic crisis that is still lingering on, and it hampers their ability to lead. The US seems to have opted for pragmatism in a multi-layered approach when it comes to national security and foreign policy. Thus, one cannot and should not be surprised about the US pivot to Asia. It is there, and it is there to stay. And it should not be perceived as a threat to transatlantic relations. Europe also is looking towards Asia. On the other hand, the European Union has also internally transformed itself through integration, and this meant the emergence of a new dimension of the transatlantic relationship alongside NATO and bilateral relations between US and European Union individual member countries. European Union has become an economic superpower, but not an important security player. European Union, will have to face its own security issues. Former US Defense Secretary Gates was right when he warned European allies about these facts. The functioning of the European Common Security and Defense Policy is not on a track it was meant to be, and the December European Union summit devoted to it is very timely. The European Union will have to do some serious assessment of the state of this policy and adopt some concrete steps of the direction it wants to go, and a broader strategic thinking is a must. Europe has to know where it wants to be, how to get there, what interests it wants to protect, and in what way. What is the correlation between common security and defense policy and NATO? Do we need both? Do we want both? Can they coexist? Speaking from my own national perspective, these are some fundamental issues that will have to be answered if Europe wants to be a strong international player without compromising any of its values. Ladies and gentlemen, the 21st century threats may not be the same as they were in the Cold War era, and they are definitely very diverse. How seriously a threat is perceived in an individual state, regionally, or in a broader context depends on many factors. But I believe there are some threats that we can all agree upon. Terrorism has been present before, but never in forms and manifestations as today. It has become the biggest single threat to allies, to our public on both sides of the Atlantic. We may have different opinions on how to address and fight it, but we understand the seriousness of a threat. New conflicts in the European neighborhood, which are also becoming grounds for growth of terrorism and terrorist organizations, should worry us, and we must do everything necessary to prevent its spread. We must use all forms, formal, informal, of cooperation to prevent possible acquisition of weapons by the terrorists. There is a threat of new and emerging armed conflicts, which are destabilizing entire regions. For instance, Somalia, Mali, Afghanistan, still. Especially in the cases of failed states. Related to that are the proliferation and illegal trafficking of weapons of mass destruction, precursors of chemical, nuclear, biological weapons. Other serious threat is definitely global financial, economic, and social crisis and risks. Unemployment, especially among the young, can grow into a bigger and even general social crisis. Europe is, because of its history and geographic position, also very exposed to the illegal migration. The recent events in Italy, Lampedusa, very clearly show the extent of the risks they represent. They are directly or indirectly connected to the questions of armed conflicts as well. Other risks that might not be so obvious but are no less serious are climate change, organized crime, cyber attacks, energy security, natural and industrial disasters. How can the transatlantic partners respond to them in time where at least sometimes there seem to be more questions than answers regarding the very fabric of our cooperation? The existence of NATO and common security and defense policy should make all these answers so much easier. But the fact is, they do not. NATO is in the process of finishing the ISAF operation in Afghanistan. NATO, I dare to say, is an evolving organization, and the talk about its relevance is always alive, and rightfully so. Members will have to face some serious questions about its existence and purpose. So, it is a live organism, and it needs the debate. I believe the time has come to do some strategic thinking about its place in the transatlantic community and globally. At the summit next year in Great Britain, we will be able to assess its performance in Afghanistan and build upon it. We will have to understand new threats and adopt new approaches. In this regard, it is clear that Europe will have to do its share. The economic and financial crisis has understandably put some hold on the promise of defense budget being or close to 2% of GDP. But nevertheless, we all know that defense is not free and that the US will not be able, or for that matter, willing to carry such a disproportionate share of transatlantic and European defense. I said I came from another event addressed by Secretary of Defense Hagel. He mentioned that 40% of the world investments in the defense is made by your country. So we all know, as I said, that defense is not free and that the US will not be able to, or for that matter, willing to carry such a disproportionate share of transatlantic and European defense. Second, with a declining defense budget, Europe might be faced with the incapability to participate in the international crisis management. If there is a void, someone else will fill it. And that will further decrease the influence Europe might otherwise have. If Europe wants to remain the standard bearer of basic principles such as liberty, democracy, rule of law, and human rights, as it was said at the very beginning of today's meeting, it will have to be able to underpin that with hard power as well. Third, NATO is a democratic and open political military organization. And in that sense, my country hopes it is, NATO, still ready to invite to join all the North Atlantic countries that clearly express the wish to be a member and who fulfill the criteria. We should be reminded that it is not only the countries that wish to join, it is also NATO who needs them. The membership brings many advantages when it comes to national security, but it does, on the other hand, bring stability and sustainable peace, and thus lowers the security challenges and threats that might exist otherwise. The European member states will have to be able to develop capabilities to conduct operations without depending on direct US support and implement an effective decision-making process that will allow actions both by NATO and the European Union. meaning Europe will have to consider the future of common security and defense policy. As I mentioned at the beginning, the December summit meeting will be a chance to do that in a broader strategic sense, including its role vis-à-vis NATO and their coexistence and cooperation. NATO and common security defense policy should implement new dialogue based on full participation, and a mechanism for continuing cooperation should be decided upon. And synergy on the military and civil use of capabilities should be explored. In that sense, current procedures and practices for interoperability between the military forces of members and partners of NATO and the European Union should be preserved and strengthened. Before I conclude, I wish to address another issue I have not yet mentioned, and that is Russia. Former Soviet Union, as I said, has for decades been a clear and present danger for NATO and West in general. Such a threat has disappeared, although historic remnants are still there. I do not mean to say that Russia is ready or willing to join NATO. What I wish to stress is that the cooperation with Russia is needed if Europe and the United States want to be able to address the most challenging global and regional security threats. As we have seen recently, Syria, chemical weapons in Syria, have clearly shown how important it is to develop a modus vivendi with Russia. Not taking it into account makes it difficult, maybe even impossible, to deal with serious threats and challenges in crisis management, including Iran, North Korea, Afghanistan, etc. There are certain past achievements that not only the US, but also NATO should build upon, such as START Treaty and cooperation in Afghanistan. Serious efforts should be devoted to confidence-building measures and improvement of transparency. Strengthening of the established institutionalized cooperation should also be a goal, as some of the arrangements lack effectiveness. Lisbon Summit of NATO a few years ago established a strategic partnership between NATO and Russia. Therefore, cooperation in strategically important areas is needed, and the NATO-Russia Council should become increasingly important and should become more resilient to crisis. As we say, it should be all-weather forum to discuss existing problems between us and them. Different economic and political systems should not stand in the way of pragmatic cooperation when it comes to security. Of course, these steps require a considerable degree of political will and leadership on the both sides. I would like to conclude to briefly stress once again maybe a couple of things, a couple of conclusions. First, transatlantic cooperation is of vital importance for both sides of the Atlantic. No matter how occupied with their own domestic issues, the US will not find a better partner than Europe, and of course, vice versa. The fact of this natural alliance should be taken advantage of. Both sides are right now at the start of the biggest trade and investment negotiations to date. Transatlantic trade investment partnerships. The success of this have an enormous potential, not just for the two sides, but globally, including by setting new sets of standards. Second, democratic institutions of the European Union and NATO and the member countries are healthy and robust. This does not mean, of course, that they should not be reformed. The experience and knowledge should always be taken into account. As I said, the European Union has to do some serious strategic thinking about its common defense and security and its relations with NATO. Third, European Union and US have to be able to maintain robust defense and deterrence. Right now, the US is in a bit better position to do that than Europe. But as I said, Europe will have to address the issues I mentioned, including budgetary ones. And finally, and right now I would say the most important one, judging upon recent developments, already mentioned by Mr. Donfried, the respect of each other, the mutual trust, the bond between US and Europe has to be reaffirmed and our relationship rebalanced, meaning we remain partners of choice who must continue to invest in the alliance, all shouldering a fair share of burden and responsibility. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Your Excellency.